Sukkot, the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles, but it's also called the Feast of our Rejoicing. The Feast of our Rejoicing. In Leviticus 23:43, the Lord commands us to celebrate for 7 days. That's the Feast of Sukkot. And it says in Leviticus that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. That you may know when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. This verse says that they didn't choose to sleep in booths. God made them. But then it says he made them to remind them that when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. When is a particular time? Yah is telling us to stay in booths to remember that first night out of Egypt. Exodus 12:37 says, and the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot. Sukkot was a place. Sukkot is the name of the very first place on the very first night that they left Egypt. Is God telling us to celebrate that first night of the Exodus? Not so much what we slept in, but where we slept at. The first mention of Sukkot is in Genesis. When Jacob left Laban, he traveled to a place called Sukkot. The Torah tells us why it was called that. Jacob built huts for his cattle and called it a Sukkot. So now here's Jacob leaving slavery, or his personal slavery, from Laban, going back to the God that was promised to his fathers Abraham and Isaac. So now in Egypt, the Israelites are leaving slavery, and the first place they stop at is Sukkot. Why celebrate that first night? What's the big deal? Exodus 12:40 says, now that the time that the children of Israel spent in Egypt was 430 years. 430 years. A different translation on that Hebrew word from dwell also means settled down or settling down. And the settling downs that the children of Israel settled down while they were in Egypt was 430 years. For 430 years, they were settled down. They were slaves, but they had a roof over their head. They knew where their next meal was coming from. They knew when they got home, they had a reliable shelter. They were slaves, but they were settled down. And the question I want to ask you is, how comfortable are we in our slavery? How comfortable are we in our slavery? And this is what Sukkot is about. Leaving slavery to become a free person, to become a free nation. We get comfortable where we're at. And this is what Sukkot is all about. That first night that they left Egypt, when they were leaving Egypt, they were rejoicing and praising and having all kinds of fun. And that very first night, they left slavery. In an instant, they were free. They found themselves that first night sleeping with the cows, that first night at Sukkot. What was that night like? Can you imagine being a slave? And then the next day, you're free. No more slave master's whip. No more slave master's whip. And now you're free. And now you're free. Just think of this. I want you to think of this right here. When you were in your despair and you cried out to the Lord, and He heard your prayer, and in an instant, He saved you. What was that moment like? What was that moment like? This is why we celebrate. We celebrate for Him leading us out of slavery. Now remember that first night that God saved you. That next morning you wake up. You're like, uh-oh, what do I do now? I was comfortable where I was at, but it's all changed. After 430 years, you breathe the first breath of freedom. It was like a dream. But they had nowhere to go, nowhere to sleep. You have to sleep with the cows and the sheep And then you ask yourself, what have I done? What have I done? What am I doing here leaving Egypt? We know how to operate in Egypt, but do we know how to operate as a free person? To add to it, the Torah tells us what they ate. They ate unleavened bread. They took everything they could carry in an instant. Exodus 12 says that a mixed crowd also went with them, as well as the livestock. See, it wasn't just the tribes of Israel. There was Egyptians. There was other nations that came out of Egypt with them. They saw the miracles that God performed, and they're like, we're leaving with these guys. So they were just absorbed into the tribes. Their inheritance was with the tribe that they dwelt with. So salvation and freedom is not just for the natural born, but it's for all people that are willing to step out and go. There are two holidays in the Torah that commemorate the same event, Pesach and Sukkot. Because we know Pesach was the day before, and then the next day it was Sukkot. The very first night they spent in the desert. The only difference is Pesach is from the perspective of food, and Sukkot from the perspective of shelter. They had an abundance of both in Egypt. They had bread, they had food, they had shelter. They didn't have to worry about anything at all. It seemed like all that stuff was free, but there was a price to pay. They were slaves. Suddenly, in an instant, they were delivered. And just like when you called out to Yeshua and he saved you, at that moment, the question is will you go? Will you go? We make the choice the moment we leave Egypt. We made a choice to embrace freedom, to accept Yah's calling to be a nation and to be a land and to go to a land that he promised us with no preparation whatsoever. In an instant, we get the choice. Are you ready to go? The choice to leave can only be a supreme act of faith, an invitation to be embraced by the divine. We set ourselves on a journey. Yah, you invited us, and we are going. Our most basic needs are now in your hands. The text tells us that they didn't even pack provisions for the journey. That first night, sleeping in a sukkah, eating the last of the matzah, realizing there's no more where that came from. There you are for the first time, utterly and totally in Yah's embrace. The one night Pesach and Sukkot are celebrated. What is the big deal about Sukkot, the feast of our rejoicing? It's the pit in your stomach in the desert when you look around and you feel all alone, only to realize that you're not alone, that God is there. And you have to completely rely on God. If God doesn't come through this night could be our last night. How many nights have we felt like that? Hopefully not as y'all having as many as I have. But Jeremiah 2:2 says, "Go and cry in the ears of Jerusalem, saying, I remember the gifts of kindness of your youth, the love of thine espousals, how you walked after me in the wilderness, in a land that was not sown." That night was a big deal. It was a big deal for us and a big deal for God. That day that you cried out and Yeshua saved you, that night was a big night. Not only for you, but that was a big night for God also. It was that night that we gave Yah that gift of trust. That word believe that we read, that actually translates into, the correct translation is trust. It's not having knowledge, but putting our complete total trust in Him. We put ourselves vulnerable in God's hands, giving our basic need for protection to Him. God saw our faith and He responded with an act of His own. He provided for us. He sheltered us. He sees our shanty towns and raises us one. He gives the cloud of glory and turns our efforts of providing for ourselves that are inadequate, and he turns it into miraculous substance and envelops us in divine clouds. We wake up day in and day out with his protection. This is what Sukkot is all about. Sleeping in a Sukkot celebrates our act of faith and trust, and the cloud that he gave us celebrates Yah's response to that act of faith with love. So both our act of faith of leaving Egypt, which is in the past, trusting in Yeshua, which he's delivering us now, and in the future, when he delivers us from this world and send us to a land that we know not, called the Promised Land, and Yah providing in the desert, which was in the past, and he supplies us with the Ruach now, and then in the future, the bridegroom. And I know men can't understand this, but women, that first night you got married, and here's your husband, and then you wake up, what did I do? This man's supposed to provide for me? Did I really think this through? So if this is true and they celebrate the same night, why are they at different times? Because we know Pesach is in Nisan and Sukkot is in Tishri. If you look, they're exactly 6 months apart. Exactly 6 months apart. We think there's no connection, but 6 months apart. If you really think about it, they are as far apart as you can get. That's when Sukkot is needed the most. It's the furthest not only from the Pesach, but it's the farthest we can get from the night when we were a sovereign nation in our land, living in our sturdy homes, secure in our harvest, secure in our works. It's in that moment, knowing that where our next meal will come from. You think about it, in the fall, we're secure right now. We're secure. We're getting ready for winter. We got it all laid up and stored up. So that's not how we do as Christians, get secure. So what is Yah telling us? To step out of our comfort. When is Yeshua coming back? When man is furthest away from Yah that they could get. And so he's calling us to celebrate and challenge ourselves. When we're getting comfortable in our settling downs, that's night we're to celebrate Sukkot. It's the time of ingathering. We become susceptible to our own self-sufficiency. That will secure our future. We get secure and we forget about the provision that God gives to us. And this is what Sukkot's all about. So now you know why we call it the Feast of our Rejoicing. And we know everyone has something to rejoice about if you're a believer in Yeshua.
Amen. Awesome.